online seminar. We've gone back to using Teams, and thanks very much to Michelle for being flexible enough to change arrangements at the last minute. Just to introduce our speaker today, our speaker is Associate Professor Michelle Hood. She works in the Griffith School of Applied Psychology. She's got a broad range of experience, lots of good publications. She's got ARC grants looking at the area that she'll be talking about today. So I don't want to sort of take too much time up sort of talking about Michelle, because she can talk about herself. What we'll do is we'll let Michelle have her talk. If everybody can make sure you're either on mute or on mute and your camera's off, that'll make things a lot easier for Michelle. The session today is being recorded. We'll turn off the recording when it comes to question and answer. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Michelle. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you, everybody. I am going to now share my screen. Okay, and as I suspected, I now actually can't see the chat or hands raised. So if anybody needs to say anything, they'll have to talk out loud, because I can't see anything except my presentation. So the talk I'm going to do today is about some work we did last year on COVID-19 as a career shock. And it's probably, I know it's wrong to say, but it's probably fortuitous that COVID's raised its ugly head again in the last 24 hours, because it sort of makes this seem a little bit more salient. Everything seemed to be going along swimmingly, but of course, this as an impact, as a shock, has not gone away and probably won't for a long time. So this is work that I've done with colleague Peter Creed from the School of Applied Psychology and Dr. Anna Praskova from Southern Cross University. Anna was a PhD student of Peter's and mine a number of years ago, and now working in the School of Psychology at Southern Cross. What we were interested in is looking at COVID-19 as a career shock, and our focus is always on either young adults in general, or my interest particularly is in university students. I'm very interested in university tertiary education as a career development activity, really, more so probably than as an educational activity per se. And so that's the population that we tend to largely focus on. And so that's the population that this work was focused on as well. So career shocks are disruptive and extraordinary events. So the name shock, they're disruptive. They tend to be infrequent, hence extraordinary, and they're caused by factors that are largely, not necessarily completely, but largely outside of the individual's control. And if you think about COVID-19, certainly disruptive, certainly extraordinary, infrequent, thank goodness, these pandemics, and in that case, probably, almost completely outside of individuals' control. But the other important characteristic of career shocks is that they trigger a really deliberate, deep, reflective thought process around one's career. Early work on defining career shocks was done by Leah Mitchell, and they talked about these shocks as jarring employees. So really that sense of a real shock, that they're jarred towards engaging in this deliberate reflection, thinking, and then judgment about their jobs. And more broadly, and more recently, people have looked at it in career paths and career development in general. So these shocks lead people to consider the implications of that event for the likelihood that their current plans and actions are going to enable them to achieve their work and career goals in the context of that shock. And so that's very much what we were interested in with COVID-19, and particularly in these people who are still completing their education with a view to that being relevant for their future career plans, and how COVID-19 may have implications for that. The idea of career shocks really is similar to the idea of career disruptions that's in some career development theories, such as Jim Bright and Pryor's chaos theory, where they really eschew the idea of planfulness and goal setting in careers because they say that there are these random chance events, this chaos that occurs and that we can't plan for, and that has a big impact on careers. Similarly, John Kromboltz talks about happenstance, so chance events that may be negative, but they can also be serendipitous. And he talks about the idea that these events will occur, but the extent to which we are prepared for and ready to act upon them will make the difference in terms of the way they affect our subsequent career development. The idea of these career shocks or career disruptions, some people would argue, is at odds with more agentic theories that really sort of place the individual in control. So theories like social cognitive career theory talks about contextual factors, but it really focuses on the individual and their efficacy and their interests, their decision making, and then their goal-related actions. Protean career theory of Hall also talks about individuals as being very much the drivers of their own career, managers of their own career, moving away from traditional career orientations of the past where people relied on organisations to manage their careers. And that, you know, we're very values driven in terms of the directions we take in our career. Shocks, career shocks can be either positive or negative in their valence, and that's really around the perceptions of the event. It's not about the valence of the outcomes of the event. Negative events tend to be more unexpected or less predictable than positive shocks are. So negative career shocks can be things like losing one's job, having a big organisational restructure that changes the work that one's doing. It can be other things like, for example, a woman getting pregnant and seeing that as being a negative event for her future career direction. Positive shocks, which are generally more predictable or can be more expected, can be things like getting a promotion, having a really good job opportunity come up, winning an award, those sorts of things. Regardless of the valence of the shock itself, the outcomes can have different valence. So negative shocks can lead to positive outcomes longer term. And this really is to do with the triggering of that reflection that leads us to engage in reevaluation of our goals, re-engage in career exploration, make new decisions, and all of that can then, of course, lead to more positive long-term outcomes. You think about COVID-19 as a career shock, which probably most of us would argue is probably more on the negative side as a shock. It still is likely to bring positive opportunities to individuals. If you think about the sort of higher education situation, Griffith University, in terms of the COVID-19 impact, people retired at the end of last year. That was probably a shock. They probably didn't expect that at the end of 2020 they would suddenly retire. That is likely to have hopefully then opened up positive long-term opportunities for them through, engaging in leisure activities or other, maybe moving into more entrepreneurial work outside of the higher education sector. It's changed for many of us the way we work. We're very good at pivoting back and forth between off and on campus. Many of us are capitalising on that to suit our flexibility better around other life domains. Some people, of course, have had redeployments and hence career or job changes. And we've also had opportunities for skill upgrades through cut price university courses and things like that. So there's a lot of things that have occurred out of what might be seen as a negative career shock that in fact may well produce positive long-term career outcomes. Surprisingly, despite the fact that career shocks have been talked about for a long time, there's limited research on them Ackermans and Kubash did a review in 2017 and found that there was, they said virtually no research. There is some, but it's very limited. They argued, or Ackermans subsequently argued, that we need to take a career developmental approach to looking at these career shocks, and that it's important to look at the interplay between the context, i.e. the shock or the event, and agentic factors. So while there's been a bit of tension around these agentic career development theories, not recognising the role of these contextual disruptions or shocks, certainly agentic factors are important in determining outcomes in career development in general, and Ackermans and colleagues and we would argue that they're important to consider in the context of career shocks. Shocks trigger that deliberation, and so that's what then is likely to stimulate agentic behavioural responses that are likely to produce better outcomes in the future for people's career paths. Some of the limited work that's been done in career shocks has certainly looked at it from a career development point of view, and looked at the sort of demographic, the sort of population around tertiary education that we're interested in. So Hershey found that both positive and negative shocks are important in determining the school to work transition, and whether that's a smooth or rough, very positive or not so positive outcome for young people. Siebert and colleagues looked at young professionals and their decision making about whether to pursue graduate study or not, and found that positive shocks and negative shocks influence that. So if somebody lost, for example, a valued mentor in the workplace, they were more likely to decide to go back and do postgraduate study. If they got a promotion, a positive shock, they were more likely to stay in the workplace rather than pursue further study. And Hershey's also done work looking at career decidedness as an outcome of these shocks. We know that individual and contextual career resources and behaviours are important in moderating both the responses to career shocks as well as the outcomes of those responses and the career shocks itself. Blocker and colleagues identified 3 types of career competencies that were important. Reflective competencies are relevant around that triggering of that deep reflection. So the competency to really evaluate the self, to gain self-awareness around one's values, one's goals, one's skills and abilities and competencies. Communicative competencies then are important to taking that forward and being able to engage in what we know are important career development activities like networking, being able to self-profile or brand or promote oneself in terms of the important things to self, the values and the attributes that one has. The behavioural career competencies really focusing on those agentic aspects, and so things like proactivity, engagement, exploration, planning, making decisions, and then engaging strategies to meet goals. And we are particularly interested in those behavioural and agentic aspects in what we've looked at. So Blocker and colleagues found that these competencies enhance the capacity of individuals to capitalise on positive shocks and to gain those positive longer-term outcomes. And others found that these competencies buffer against negative shocks by increasing engagement, employability, and enhancing resilience to those negative shocks. And again, ensuring that the outcomes over the longer term are less negative. There's been a number of theoretical approaches used to look at career shocks. One of the largely used ones is event system theory, developed by Morgeson and colleagues. And that really, as the name suggests, focuses in on the event, looks at the contextual characteristics of the event, the organisational context, the work context. It doesn't really focus on the individual. And so because we come from a psychology background, we were more interested in the individual rather than the characteristics of the event per se. Career construction theory has also been looked at in terms of understanding career shocks. This career is a very agentic theory. It argues that people construct their own careers. And one of the central constructs is adaptability. And so research has shown that higher adaptability facilitates positive shock and buffers against negative shock in terms of future career development. A third theory that's been widely used, and one which informed the first study that I'll talk about, is affective events theory. So this theory by Weiss and Copanzano, it suggests that these work events, these shocks, trigger affective reactions, which then in turn shape attitudes and behaviours. And these, the relationship between the triggering event, the inducing event, and the affective reaction is moderated by affective dispositions. So that moderation of that initial relationship between the event and the affective reaction by the affective dispositions is what explains different responses and outcomes that we see in different individuals to the same triggering event. Mostly what's been examined as a moderator has been positive or negative affectivity from a trait or a dispositional perspective. What we want to do was to extend this to examine agentic and motivational moderators drawn from self-regulatory theories like goal-setting theory, which is the typical sort of theoretical framework that we do most of our work from. So in the first study, we used this affective event theory, and we extended on that by looking at COVID-19 as the inducing event or the career shock. A lot of the work with AET has looked at work events, things like getting negative customer feedback, those sorts of things. We then took a career developmental focus. Again, most of the work in the AET area has looked at worker organisational outcomes, things like job satisfaction, job performance, turnover intentions. We want to really look at career development outcomes given the population of students who were still preparing for their career that we were focused on. And as I mentioned, we looked at agentic and motivational moderators drawn from self-regulatory approaches rather than the dispositional affectivity that's been mostly looked at in this area. So the model that we tested in this first study had negative and positive perceptions of the impact of COVID-19 and how that then was related to affective responses. We looked at both career-specific as well as more general COVID-related aspects of distress as the affective response, and then how that related to beliefs that they would have to compromise on their career goals in the future. We looked at the role of career agency in moderating the relationships between the career shock and the affective responses, and then we looked at career goal commitment in moderating the relationships between those affective responses and the beliefs that they would have to compromise on that career goal in the future. We had around 400 students recruited from Griffith. They were fairly typical students because the research was done after the COVID shutdown of last year had occurred. We had lost a lot of international students, and so we had a higher percentage than we would typically find of domestic students. But other than that, they were fairly typical, probably slightly fewer full-time. Some students dropped back to part-time as a response to COVID. And on average, they were just above average on their subjective rating of their social status on a 1 to 100 scale, which again is fairly typical of what we find with the university student population. One of the first problems we had is that there was no measure that we thought was suitable for measuring what we were interested in terms of COVID-19 as a career shock. And there were a number of scales that came out very rapidly last year around COVID-19, but they were largely around the emotional response to COVID-19. So fear of it, obsession with it, stress related to it, that sort of thing. And that wasn't what we wanted to have as the focus for the actual career shock or the career impact. There are also career shock scales, and they were also, we didn't think they were suitable for what we wanted to know about, because they largely are more like inventories where there's just a list of shocks, like got an unexpected promotion, had an award, lost my job, had a change in my work arrangements, those sort of things. We really wanted to take more of a perceptions around the impacts of this event. And we wanted to tap into positive and negative aspects. And so we set about developing a deliberately brief scale that tapped into a range of dimensions of positive and negative impacts of COVID-19, impacts on their time, their activities, their social life, their sense of purpose or meaning, their status, and financial material type aspects as well. So we developed 6 items each for positive and negative, and engaged in a career development process. We found that 3 of the negative items worked, and they were items around purpose, status, and financial impacts of the COVID-19 event. We found that all 6 of the positive ones worked. And so these are just a couple of examples about having more time to reflect on important things, feeling like they've grown as a person as a result of this event, and that things like money and materiality are less important as a result. So we tested the model based on AET theory using a moderated mediation model through the process macro in SPSS. And this is what we found, which is probably a bit cluttered, but I will talk through it. So for negative COVID impacts, so perceptions that it interfered with their sense of purpose and status and impacted on their financial means, that was associated with more career-related distress, as well as with more COVID-related distress. It had a stronger relationship with the career-related distress than with more general COVID distress. Surprisingly to us, the positive COVID impact, seeing it as having positive benefits around growth and purpose and time and those sorts of things, that actually also increased stress, although more weakly than the negative impact. And so it increased both the career-related distress and the COVID-related distress. That positive impact was more strongly related to the general COVID-related distress than it was to the career distress. Each of those 2 types of distress then were related positively to beliefs that they would have to compromise on their career goals in the future. And the career-related distress was the stronger influence on that compromise. Agency reduced the career distress. It didn't affect the COVID-related distress, and goal commitment reduced the sense that they would be compromising in the future. But these 2 factors also had moderating effects that shape the way we need to think about some of those direct relationships. So we found that that unexpected relationship between positive COVID impact and career-related distress was moderated by career agency. When career agency was low, career distress was high regardless of the impact of COVID. And it was the high levels of agency that reduced the career distress, even though the more they felt COVID had an impact, regardless of whether it was positive, there was still an increase in their distress around their career. The negative COVID impact had more of the typical, what we expected. We expected that it would increase distress, and we found that in general it did increase career distress as people reported more negative impact of COVID. But again, that agency, when it was high, that was buffered, it was reduced. People who were low on agency were higher on career distress across the board. We then found in the second half of the model that people who had stronger commitment to their current goals, then that buffered against the impact of the distress on the thought that they would have to compromise. So on the bottom line in the graph here, people who were strongly committed to their current career goal were suggesting less beliefs that they would compromise on that goal in the future, even in the face of stronger distress around COVID. People who showed little commitment to their current career goals increasingly were reporting compromise as the levels of COVID distress increased as well. So that first study really looked at more stronger relationships with negative career shock through to what you could think of as negative longer term outcomes, although keeping in mind this was cross-sectional, and so in the immediacy of the career shock, they were seeing that this would lead to more likelihood that in the future there'd be negative outcomes that they would have to compromise. We wanted to try to understand more about the potential for more positive outcomes, and to do that we looked at more of the behavioural mechanisms through which the COVID shock might operate in terms of producing more positive outcomes. Again, this is cross-sectional, so we don't have that longitudinal data, but trying to at least get a theoretical model for what might potentially occur over time. So again, we looked at positive and negative impact of the COVID event, and in this case, we looked at behavioural activities around engagement with university and engagement with their career exploring, planning, interacting with mentors, that sort of thing, and how they were related through to future career optimism. So beliefs that despite the COVID event, that there would be opportunities in the future, they would have good career outcomes, that sort of thing. And we used proactivity this time, more of a dispositional trait to moderate in this model. Because we had university, so non-specific career-related behaviours, we didn't want to use those really career-related agentic and motivational moderators. Proactivity is more generic, more dispositionally based, and so we use that to moderate in this second model. For this model, we drew students a larger sample and a more diverse sample from both of the participating universities. We ended up as a result with an older, on average, slightly older cohort. We had more mature age students. We had almost an even mix between full-time and part-time students, and we managed to collect slightly more international students in that mix. But other than that, much of the sample demographics were quite similar to the first study. So again, a busy little model. So I will talk you through this one. What we found with this one is that we got more of what we expected around the relationships with negative versus positive impact. So negative impact was related to less university engagement and less career engagement. Positive impact was related to more university engagement and more career engagement. This model, we didn't do as well as explaining variance in these behavioural engagement measures as we did in the affective measures in the first model, but we certainly found more of the expected patterns of relationships with the different valence of the COVID impact. Both forms of engagement in university and careers were related to stronger future optimism around their careers, and the path from career engagement, not surprisingly, was stronger than from the more generic university engagement to that career optimism. Proactivity had direct relationships with both forms of engagement as well as optimism, but also moderated several of the paths, so need to consider some of those relationships in the context of that moderation. So, as expected, the perceptions that COVID had a negative impact on their lives reduced university engagement across the board, but people who were more proactive, that was a buffer. They reduced engagement, but much less so than people who were low on proactivity. But as that negative perceptions of negative impact increased, there was a decrease in general. With positive COVID impact, proactivity moderated the relationship between it and career engagement. So we had a moderation between negative impact and university engagement, and between positive impact and career engagement. So positive impact, as that was perceived to be more positive, career engagement was higher, and again, proactivity buffered or facilitated that career engagement. So people who were more proactive were engaging in more career activities across the board, and that increased as the positive nature of their perceptions of COVID increased. We also found proactivity moderating paths in the second half of the model. So the path between negative COVID impact and future career optimism, so a direct path through from that negative impact to the outcome. When people were not proactive, they didn't have a lot of optimism, and it didn't really change, no matter how negative the perceptions of COVID were. As the perceptions of COVID were more negative, we found that optimism decreased, but again, higher levels of proactivity buffered against that. Career engagement to optimism was also buffered by proactivity. More career engagement was related to more optimism, and people who were higher on proactivity, that relationship was higher across the board. So again, proactivity as a disposition was an important buffer in these relationships and protecting against that future optimism, despite the impact of COVID. So overall, what we found was that these university students were perceiving COVID as having both positive and negative impacts, or being both positive and negative career shock. Certainly they were reporting higher scores on the negative shock than on the positive shock, but certainly there were elements of both. Both of them triggered distress, the negative more so, but even when they were perceiving the COVID-19 to be positive in its impact on their lives, there was still distress associated with that. And so it didn't seem to matter about what the valence was, that this was a distressing event, regardless. Those affective reactions then mediated between the impact of COVID and that career outcome, the belief that they would have to compromise on their future career goals. Career distress had a stronger negative relationship with that compromise than just general COVID. So this was really about COVID having an impact on their affect around their career, the stress related with their career, and then through that to their career goals and whether or not they'd be able to meet them. It wasn't just a case of COVID affecting everything in their lives. Yes, it did, and that had an independent effect, but the strong one was through the career distress. But importantly, what we found is that these agentic and motivational factors buffered these negative outcomes. They reduced the negative distress, and they reduced the likelihood that people would have to compromise or believe that they would have to compromise on their goals in the future. We found that the valence of the shock predicted the behavioural engagement in more expected ways, negative shock reducing it and positive shock increasing it. And the positive shock was really about the idea of freeing up time, aiding growth and those sort of things, which was then related to that engagement. The engagement in career planning and exploration, that career engagement was more important than general university engagement to their optimism about their future careers, but the university engagement was still relevant. Proactivity, that dispositional trait to be proactive, make things happen, change things to suit the way you want them to be, that facilitated the positive impact on career engagement and buffered the negative impact on university engagement. It also buffered the negative impact of COVID on future career optimism and facilitated that effect of career engagement on future career optimism as well. So I guess the conclusions are that these positive career shocks will trigger distress, but they are also more likely to trigger effective behavioural responses, which are probably the important thing in producing long-term positive outcomes. They were certainly related through to that optimism. Negative career shocks were more likely to trigger greater distress and to reduce that engagement that would be effective in producing good long-term outcomes. We think that we agree with our results agree with what Ackermans and his colleagues argued, that it's important to consider the interplay of the shock and agentic factors. These agentic factors and the behaviours that people engage in are the things that we think are most likely to then determine the positive or negative outcomes over the long term, regardless of what the valence of that perception of the actual career shock is at the time. So thank you for that. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Michelle.
And end my show.